Okay, everybody, welcome back to Your Crisis Coach with Scott H. Silverman and myself, Fred Carroll. We got our guest finally. We got our man back again. How are you?
Good, doing well. Good to see you guys again.
You too. We had to get you on because Scott was very excited talking to you the other day, and I'm always excited when you come on because you do the talking, and all I have to do is listen. So I learned that lesson, and you're far intelligent on the subjects that we talk about. So, and I think it's very important. So, Scott, go ahead, ask a few questions and get your interest peaked.
Yeah, Michael, welcome. It's good to see you for the morning show. Really early, I was here at 10 to 7 a.m. on the Pacific Coast time. So, but I get up early. I go to an early meeting. Michael Brown, would you mind terribly, because I know there's some people that don't know you. There can't be many, and the only reason they wouldn't is because they were incarcerated and don't watch TV or listen to the news. But share with our audience, a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you've been doing. And then we're going to talk about, kind of carrying the conversation forward that we had the other day, because I think I shared with you that I think the insight you have is as a experiential thought leader needs to be heard. So a little bit about you, and then we're going to go into some updates that you can share, want to share, willing to share.
Yeah, Scott, hey, thanks again for the invitation. I think this is an incredibly important conversation to have regarding, the opioid crisis, fentanyl, and the cartels. My name is Michael Brown. I'm recently retired senior special agent from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. I spent 32 years with the agency, approximately 20 years working overseas in most of all the drug production countries as either a special agent or a special agent in charge. I primarily focused on precursor chemicals, those chemicals used to make narcotics such as heroin, fentanyl, of course, cocaine, and what have you. My main concept has always been, if you can reduce the availability of the precursor chemicals, you can dismantle or mitigate the threat of cartels making narcotics, because most opioids are all synthetic, or most opioid products are all synthetic. So without those critical chemicals, you can't make those narcotics. And of course, fentanyl is 100% synthetic. And we know from a long history of investigations and other information that the majority of that fentanyl is coming from China, and some degree the precursors from China, some degree India. But so now that I've retired, I'm a private consultant. I work with various companies, foreign governments, and agencies on how to develop mitigation strategies, on how to use various new technologies, how they can be integrated into counter-narcotic mitigating strategies to really break the hold the cartels have on this country.
Mike, share with people, because it's interesting. The word cartel is kind of used like the word mafia. What is the cartel? Because a lot of people, they hear it in the news all the time. Usually it's, Mexican cartel. What is the definition of a cartel, and what is a cartel? What is a simplified version of what the makeup of a cartel is?
Well, basically, people use that term cartel referring to like the Mexican cartels or the Colombian cartels. But really, a cartel, in my opinion, is any large-scale organization that's involved in the production and distribution of narcotics, right? So the Sinaloa cartel, or even, the organized crime groups, the Italian mafia, right? Those are called organized crime groups. They are kind of a cartel also, excuse me, because they sell narcotics, but they are also involved in other criminal activities. But when we say cartel, we're really looking at those groups whose primary focus is on the production and distribution of narcotics.
I'm going to look the word up real quick, because I'm curious. You hear it all the time. Group of independent entities like drug lords and businesses that collude to control a market, fixed prices. Almost sounds like our federal government. Often leading to massive profits, creating instability, and facing legal challenges in the context of illegal drugs.
All right.
Interesting. Okay, that's great.
When you think about the Medellin cartel, which was the first cartel, Pablo Escobar he got all the top drug organizations together and created that cartel, right? So as you said in your definition, it's a combination of various groups that come together for a single purpose of criminality.
Right. And what's fascinating, I think, what I've learned about the cartel is their profit-driven core values are never going to change. They're profit-driven. They know that their product that they sell or have been selling leads to either addiction or potential morbidity for people who are consuming it. And since we know about fentanyl being synthetic, it's easy to manufacture, and people can get it on the dark web, and they want to be their own little mini cartel, if you will, in little cities outside of Wycombe County, for example. And it's amazing how people want to kind of be like them, so to speak, and grow something that domestically can make them important and make them a lot of money as well. And I think with all the different things that are going on with our leadership in our country, people feel like if they don't take care of themselves, who's going to take care of them? And some have chosen to go that way. But back to part of the reason I wanted you to join us before the end of the year, because I think your insight is important. We're seeing on the news what they want us to see or what they're capturing about. I want to talk about Venezuela for a second. I want to talk about the boats. A buddy of mine lives in Costa Rica, and we were having this conversation. Yeah, he goes, those boats can't go more than 100 miles anyway unless they put extra gas tanks on them. And if they're, looking to put more gas tanks, they run the risk and the weight, and all the go-fast boats do that. And he goes, they're not the ones that are moving narcotics, and I'm sure they are, but what is your thought on what's happening in Venezuela from a perspective of our military is now they're, shooting at boats, and, they're doing it from, I don't know, a couple thousand feet up, 5,000 feet up, and that they don't know that, I don't think they've actually blown a boat up and, gone to the water and captured whatever the cargo or contraband was to verify what they're getting. But they're telling everybody that it's contraband and it's cocaine or it's fentanyl, and they're taking it and they're sinking to the bottom of the ocean. What's your experience of what's really taking place with those boats? And then of course the second part of that is what are we gaining with the military? I think the death toll now is like 95 people have been killed. They don't know. Some people may be below deck on some of the boats. But
sure.
What's your read on all that?
I look at this, and I'm neither pro nor con. I'm just looking at it, as an analyst, and we're trained to look at these situations and give you the perspective, give you the meaning. First, let's talk about the GO. We asked a lot of questions. We could probably talk for hours on the subject matter. Let's look at these go-fast boats. When I was with DEA, I worked in Honduras and Guatemala and Central America, and part of our mitigation efforts were to target these go-fast boats, moving, multiple tons of cocaine from Venezuela and Colombia through the Caribbean into the United States or through the Pacific side into California. And basically, when you look at these go-fast boats, these are not fishing boats. These are specially designed boats with 4 to 5 very large, very powerful outboard motors. And they generally carry enough fuel to take them hundreds of miles. But you can see from a lot of the aerial photographs on some of these boats, you can see where the cocaine is being stored, and you can see where the fuel tanks are. Now, when we talk about narcotics being transported with these go-fast boats, this is cocaine, right? This is cocaine coming in from Colombia, Peru, in some degree, Bolivia. Venezuela, which is what people don't understand, Venezuela is a key central storage hub and operational center for the Mexican cartels as well as the Colombian cartels, right? President Maduro has set up Venezuela as a narco-state, which 100% supports the criminal operations of the drug cartel. So massive tons of cocaine are produced. They're transported to Venezuela, where they're then split up and delivered via go-fast boats, submariners, which you're seeing the partial vehicles that can go under the water, those submarines that can carry narcotics. And then we also see aircraft, small Cessna engine aircrafts moving cocaine from Venezuela and Colombia into Honduras and Guatemala, where it then goes overland into the United States. So again, Venezuela plays a key role for the cartels and moving multiple tons of cocaine. Now, what I think is happening with these drone strikes, this is a mitigation effort to reduce the capability of the cartels to move hundreds of metric tons of cocaine into the United States, right? If that can be accomplished, the cartels then have a transportation problem. Now they have hundreds of kilograms of cocaine stacking up in Venezuela that they cannot move fast enough to their U.S. market and their international market, right? That's going to force the cartels to do two different things. One, they're going to have to increase the small Cessna aircraft transportation of cocaine from Venezuela and Colombia into Honduras and Guatemala, or to be picked up and taken overland to Mexico. Or two, it's going to push more cocaine south down into Ecuador and Brazil, where we know it's being containerized and primarily sent to Europe, but also cocaine is being pushed down into Argentina and being pushed out through their ports into Europe and the United States. And I was just in Argentina 2 weeks ago when I talked to the counter-drug authorities down there, and they're seeing an increase in cocaine coming from Colombia, Bolivia, through Paraguay into Argentina, and then being pushed out through their international ports. So this is what's going to happen. If Venezuela is taken off the board as a centralized hub, that creates a major distribution and support hub for the cartels. Now they have multiple tons of cocaine coming out of Colombia and Peru that they cannot move. There's no way for them to move all that cocaine via containerized cargo through Ecuador, Belize, and Argentina, where we have active DEA offices now working with those countries. And I have to anticipate that DEA, as well as those countries, are expecting that transition in cartel transportation of multi-ton quantities of cocaine, right? So if the U.S. if the U.S. can reduce that maritime go fast traffic significantly enough, think of it as being in a pressure cooker. You're decreasing the capability of the cartels to have this large outreach through maritime narcotic transportation. That forces them to spend millions of dollars, billions of dollars, redeveloping their transportation networks now to aircraft. But you've got to anticipate that Guatemala and Honduras will start to interdict more aircraft cocaine drops, and they will begin to mitigate that as well. So you understand this entire process. You can see how it's going to significantly disrupt cartel cocaine production and transportation. Now, what does this do? This takes billions of dollars out of the overall narcotic production mechanism, right? Money made from cocaine sold in the United States goes back into the cartels. They use some of that money to purchase precursor chemicals for fentanyl. To produce fentanyl in Mexico, to smuggle fentanyl across the United States, and then distribute it throughout their U.S. domestic cartel affiliates. So any money that can be taken out of the cartel's industrial network reduces the amount of fentanyl that can be put on the street, right? So that's a long way around, but it's the first step in what I believe is a very large-scale mitigation operation forced to cause the cartels to restructure their entire narcotics transportation network. And of course, if Venezuela falls, then we start to look at Mexico. How do we get into Mexico and directly disrupt the production of fentanyl?
So that being said, when the supply gets tighter, I would assume that prices domestically are going to go up higher, which means people are going to need more disposable income if they want to buy cocaine, I would assume. And secondly, the theory behind the working model of eliminating those go-fast boats in Venezuela will have some potential positive effect on the slowdown of cocaine, but it's a major interruption to the cartel. So they're going to have to redirect. They're going to have to, come up with new ideas. And I think we'll talk about that in a minute because we chatted about that the other day. But they're not going to let their product sit on the dock and just rot away. They're going to get it. They're going to get it somewhere, because if they have a certain level of cash flow they need and want every day, they're not going to shut their business down. They're going to they're going to have to find a different way to do it, whether it's flying or tunnels or the border itself. So it's a good thing in theory what the government's doing with taking these boats out of the water. But why isn't the leadership explaining it to the citizens of this country why it's a good thing, rather than just, clandestinely going out, blowing up boats, putting a huge amount of military down there to do that, and then taking the flack because people don't understand or it hasn't been explained? Does that make sense? Why aren't people saying what you're saying? Why aren't people saying, here's what's going on, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and this is going to be the outcome? It's not the fix forever, but it's certainly going to slow things down. And maybe while things slow down, we can push the idea of going, look, you could pay, 100% or 1,000, or Trump says 600, 800, 1,700% more for your drugs. Or if you've got a problem, maybe this is a good time to think about getting help for it.
Well, I mean, what did COVID teach us? COVID taught us that supply chains are critical. And if supply chains are disrupted or partially immobilized, then prices go up and it creates panic within the market. So you can imagine, certainly I'm not speaking for the administration. I'm giving you certainly my analytical perspective on what, as an agent, this is what I think's happening. This is what I would do if I was the guy in charge. As to why the administration is not explaining this in detail, I can't answer that question. I think maybe perhaps more detail would be useful to explain to the American public that this is not simply a game of whack-a-mole and we're just taking target practice at these go fast with no larger idea in mind as to how this is, why we're doing it this way, right? Protecting means and methods and that sort of thing. But certainly it's an opportunity to start looking at putting into action some major drug rehabilitation programs, because if we begin to see the price of cocaine increase, as well as other narcotics, to make up for the loss in cocaine sales, that means it's going to be harder for, let's just say, your long-term serious drug users to acquire cocaine. Now, we know cocaine is used by millions of people as a recreational drug. It's not like heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, which I qualify as more your serious drug user addiction, whereas cocaine, some, but leisure as well. But it's would be an excellent time to increase the funding and programs in anticipation of a spike in cocaine or all narcotic prices. Makes it more difficult to obtain, more people looking for rehabilitative services to deal with withdrawal and other issues. But we also could see a spike in local crime, right? People breaking into more stores, robbing people to get their fix, right? So you're going to see this disruption within cities, within the inner cities, within the homeless community, within the long-term traditional drug population, that we're going to have to anticipate and be ready for that potential spike in criminality. But that'll peak and then it'll drop, and then we can begin to get people into rehab. Because until you cut what I call the oversupply of narcotics, then you can't really effectively deal with rehabilitation and getting people off of narcotics. It's too much is coming in. For every person you may get through rehab, there's another 20 people who are becoming addicted or getting into that long-term traditional drug use phase where they just simply can't get out.
So, hey, Michael, quick question. Does cocaine have a shelf life?
Cocaine, if it's stored properly, can last quite a while. I don't have the specific shelf life, but the way they pack it, dry it, and store it in a very dry facility, it can last quite a long time. Because you think by the time a kilogram is made in a laboratory in Colombia, let's say in July, by the time it reaches Mexico, it could be July, it could be September, October. And then it moves from Mexico into the United States, say to Chicago, where it then sits in a drug dealer's warehouse until he can cut it. And then it hits the street maybe November, September, or November, December. So you could be looking at 6 to 7 months. And we're talking about, millions of kilos being containerized in Venezuela and being shipped to Amsterdam, right? Those containers can stay on the water for 6 months in a compressed container where it's as hot. You've got a lot of heat. So those kilos are wrapped in such a way that the heat can't get in, and then it preserves the integrity of the drug until it can get to its final destination.
Interesting.
And I would think the way the consumer consumes it, it'll get used before it goes bad. And in most cases, it's usually being cut with something that probably distills it more than actually the because it's a leaf that grows wild, and then they process it.
Right.
And I like the way you use the word serious drug user. I was a serious drug user. And I've never really met a non-serious drug user when you use those terms together. And the interesting thing is that the potency, if you will, or the purity of drugs today are a lot different than they used to be as well. And we see that, with methamphetamine, and then, 95% of the people arrested in San Diego, according to the data from the coroner, is laced with some fentanyl or some other, narcotic. So, it's not just marijuana you're smoking, or it's not just methamphetamine you're taking, or it's not just cocaine. It's laced with other drugs, usually fentanyl, which is increases the potency for the end user anyway. And most serious drug users, if one is too many, 1,000's not enough. They'll take another hit, or they'll buy another gram, or they'll consume something else to amplify the feeling. That's what drug seekers like to do.
When we talk about drug purity levels have been very high for a very long time. Cocaine has always been 98 to 90% pure. Methamphetamine has always been very pure. Heroin is always, because if it's not pure, nobody's going to buy it. So if I'm a distributor, if I'm Latin King's gang in Chicago or wherever, and I'm buying a kilo of coke, I want that to be 99% pure, because I'm going to cut it. And what most people don't realize is the Mexican cartels aren't cutting their drugs with xylazine, with benzodiazepines, with mitazines. Those are domestic drug trafficking groups, right? People need to understand the supply chain. Sinaloa cartel sells 40 kilograms to the Crips, the Bloods, the Aryan Nation, Hell's Angels. Those groups then go out and get fentanyl. They buy fentanyl from the cartels. They cut it into the heroin, into the methamphetamine, into the cocaine, right? These domestic gangs and criminal organizations are the number one strategic threat, because they are the main distributors for the cocaine or all the drugs being produced by the cartels. So the cartels are selling, kilograms of pure fentanyl powder, and they're selling the pills, right? The fake counterfeit pills to various criminal groups in the United States, who then redistribute that. But if I'm a Hell's Angels or a Bandito member of the outlaw motorcycle gang, I'm going to buy that kilo of fentanyl that's 100% pure, and then I'm going to cut it with xylazine, with benzodiazepines, with nitazines. There's a new one out called mitamidine, which is an animal tranquilizer 200 times more powerful than xylazine. Because the more I can cut my primary substance down, the more money I can make. I can stretch that kilo into 5 or 6 kilos, and then sell those dime bags with more xylazine than fentanyl, because xylazine is very cheap. Drug traffickers used to cut drugs with like lactose or some other benign substance, baby powder, to increase the volume. But they realized through domestic chemistry that if they put xylazine in it, they can increase the potency of the fentanyl, which increases the addiction, which increases the ability to sell more narcotics, right? So they're using a very sophisticated business model. Just like any commercial food producer, they may put some artificial substances in to make a particular food taste really good. And now we have an obesity problem in the United States.
So that being said, even if the cartels decided tomorrow, we're going to take a year off of our distribution to the U.S., there's a distribution center and there's warehouses and containers on their way here now. So domestically, because, you and I talked about this the other day, that the percentage, for example, use San Diego border, 75,000 people to 90,000 people crossing every day. The Border Patrol basically inspects up to 3%, maybe 3% of the vehicles. So 97% is getting through. And then you hear on the news, 200 pounds of fentanyl seized. And then you see, the grandstanding in DC, look how well we're doing with confiscating drugs, in a community that we've been watching. But the amount that's getting through, and I think the the DEA says that maybe up to 10% is seized, maybe. And I think it's probably lower than that. But what do we do? What are we doing domestically to try to work on that? And I know that then we're going to get into the state versus the Fed conversation, because I think that's important. How do you, as a subject matter expert, perceive law enforcement? And I think they're doing a great job as far as increasing seizures, but the problem is the volume of what's coming in. If the percentage stays the same, the volume is overwhelming, meaning there's enough for everybody. And when you hear these stories about we arrested and confiscated enough fentanyl that was enough to give to 125 million people, I mean, it sounds like we're eradicating the drug problem, but we're not.
Well, let's go back to how the majority of narcotics are smuggled into the country, because it's important for people to understand what's happening. 98% of all narcotics smuggled into this country come through what we call the ports of entry, right? The legal ports of entry, like San Isidro. On a daily basis, 72,000 cars pass through that checkpoint. And the cartels know that there's no way for CBP, to Customs and Border Protection, to effectively search 100% of those vehicles. So the majority of those vehicles, I would say a significant portion of those vehicles, are carrying narcotics in concealed compartments, which we call traps, right? So in Mexico, there's an entire industry that's dedicated to taking cars and trucks apart and hiding narcotics into them, right? There's a separate industry that's dedicated towards reconstructing furniture and putting narcotics in the furniture, into electrical equipment, in refrigerators. There's an entire narco containment industry that facilitates the concealment of narcotics so they can be smuggled across the border. Now, the problem is we don't know how much is being produced. We don't know how much is being smuggled into the country. It's all best guesstimate. You seize 400 kilograms, and we look at the distribution around the country, and we figure that's just 1%. But what we're doing in the United States, DEA, HSI, the FBI, state and local, they are doing the absolute best they can with the tools they have. Remember, drug seizures have to come with prosecution. Prosecution, building cases, takes a long time. Now, many of the cases I worked in Detroit targeting the large domestic trafficking groups. For example, there was a group called Best Friends. This was an inner city Detroit gang that was bringing in cocaine and distributing it. That investigation, including wire intercepts, undercover surveillance, monitorization, took 7 to 8 months for one group of criminals, and it took 10 to 11 agents dedicated towards that one group. Now, meanwhile, all the other small groups, which want to be big groups, are moving narcotics. We can't look at all those groups at the same time, right? DEA has roughly 4,000 agents. How many drug traffickers are there in the United States? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals involved in narcotic distribution. So given the laws that we have, given the framework for prosecution that we have, it takes time to build a case to get successful prosecution. By the time that Best Friends case was done, there were 10 other organizations that came up and we had to refocus on. So, it's a continuous reinventing the wheel to keep the United States from being overrun with narcotic trafficking, right? And, 600 pounds of fentanyl, that's saving probably 100,000 lives in the long run. So each one of those DEA seizures or law enforcement seizures of fentanyl is saving tens of thousands of lives, but it's not addressing the core problem, because the core problem, or center of gravity, as I call it, is where drugs are produced. That's Mexico, that's Colombia, that's Peru, that's Bolivia. Where do the precursor chemicals come from? Primarily from China. Until you can address what I call the critical capabilities of the cartels to acquire the chemicals, to clandestinely produce the narcotics, and then smuggle them across the border, you're not going to significantly mitigate their capability to distribute, addict, and kill tens of thousands of people in the United States.
So, Michael, what country does do it right? Who has the lowest amount of addiction rate?
Well, the U.S. obviously is the highest addiction rate in the country. Europe is following close behind because they perceive criminal activity or narcotic addiction, drug addiction as more of a social problem than a law enforcement problem. But when you look at, excuse me, you look at Southeast Asia, you look at Korea, you look at India, you look at Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, they don't have a big drug use problem because culturally, the entire country is against drug use. The entire country stands strong against drug organizations, and they come out and they treat it as an infestation and they crush it. So it never gets whole. If you come to the United States, depending on which state you're in, if you're in New York State, the drug perception is more progressive harm reduction. How can we enable people to use drugs safely? If you go to Florida, it's completely different. It's we want to get rid of all drugs and all drug trafficking, and we don't agree with progressive harm reduction. So from state to state, the mentality changes on the perception of drug trafficking, drug usage, and criminality. If you go to South Korea, there's no deviation. All drug traffickers are bad, all drug users are bad, and they don't tolerate it. So those organizations, criminal organizations, don't have the strong foothold. And one of the reasons you don't see fentanyl in Europe like you do in the United States is because I believe those criminal organizations are looking at the United States. They don't want all that attention, right? They can sell cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, keep the death rate low, keep the violence low, don't drop the bodies, don't have bodies dropping on your street corners. In law enforcement, they treat you as a criminal, right? If we catch you, we catch you. If we don't, But if, say, in Finland tomorrow, Sinaloa cartel sells 60 kilograms of fentanyl to local drug traffickers, and Finland has 20,000 overdoses in 6 months, they will come out extremely aggressive, I believe, like a counterterrorism stance, and they will go after that problem. So European criminal organizations are like, we really don't want all that attention. We just want to sell our drugs and keep the status quo as it is, in my opinion.
Question for you. I spent some time in Amsterdam, we're largest heroin port supposedly in the world. And I was a hash distributor, in Amsterdam, working part-time while I was traveling. It was interesting how, everything was sold at the bars. You go in there, you go here. And I had just come from Turkey, where, this was before the Midnight Express came out. And then I nearly was arrested once or twice just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was kind of scary to watch that. But you're culturally, the difference in other parts of the world is interesting when you say that they take the position. And it seems, you go off real quick. You mentioned, I don't think I've heard it framed like that before. Harm reduction is learning how to use drugs safely. Is that what you said?
Yeah, if you go to New York City, they have 2 safe injection site locations where anybody can come in with any amount, with under 2 to 3 grams of narcotics, heroin, coke, methamphetamine, even fentanyl. And they'll check it for you. They'll do a scan to make sure it doesn't have fentanyl. And it's okay. Now you have a safe place to use it. But it's up to the individual. If they say, hey, your cocaine has fentanyl in it, the user can still go in and use it, but they'll have the Narcan ready, right? So I see that as trying to make dangerous drug use safer, trying to manage dangerous drug use instead of trying to eradicate it as they would. You would never see a safe injection site location in South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, right? Because that whole concept doesn't make sense to them. Why would we help somebody take something that that's going to ultimately kill them at some point in time? Let's just take it off the board. We'll try and treat people, but we're going to go after criminal organizations, and it's completely unacceptable at any level.
It's because we in our treatment center, we talk about harm reduction. We farm people out to MDs to do it, but I see harm reduction as if somebody who is addicted to something, if there's an alternative that they can be given, or they can taper down through supervision. Sure. But I don't think I've actually heard it framed like that, and it's an interesting point because I think. And San Francisco, I think, is the other city that has done this, the safe sites. And I don't think the data has ever come out to say this helps.
Well, I mean, let me be very clear. I agree with harm reduction in the sense of let's work with users. Let's get them off of hard narcotics. Let's use Suboxone. Let's use other treatment programs. But when I use the term progressive harm reduction, like New York City, they had a vending machine which gave out crack pipes, right? Specially designed crack pipes in kits because glass pipes crack and they cut users' mouths. So I said, well, let's create a vending machine where crack users can get good crack pipes to smoke their drugs. And I saw some interviews of people who are addicted to crack cocaine. They're like, this is great. I can smoke all the crack in the world and not worry about cutting my lips. That's progressive harm reduction, right? Making it safer to use dangerous narcotics.
Yeah.
Now, they'll tell you, yes, we've reduced the overdose rates around some of these injection sites not because people aren't using drugs, because we're bringing them back with Narcan. And then they're coming back the next day and doing it again. At some point in time, those individuals are going to go around the corner and they're going to buy something from a dealer and nobody's going to be there to save them, right? So you're enabling a long-term medical issue, which at some point will kill them if the fentanyl doesn't kill them, right? So, and of course we're saying, okay, well, that gives us time to treat them. Well, how many people are you actually treating and saving that aren't recidivating, going back to drug use? Right.
Well, and when you talk to the emergency room doctors, and they call them the frequent flyers out here, that when you're seeing the same person 2 or 3 times a week, and now with Suboxone and other things that are going on, of course, methadone, was the alternative for many, many years for heroin, and there's been threats about potentially closing, but I think. And I don't know, I think of methadone as harm reduction, but ultimately, because we see people who come in with alcohol, methamphetamine, and maybe prescription drugs. And, we're looking for abstinence, but we know it's not going to happen overnight. And if someone's willing to come through and they'll have their testing done and they'll monitor the UAs and the taper's working and a doctor's suit, that's different. But the person who's, the drug seeker, they're just, look, my own experience is if LSD wasn't helping me, I'd find mushrooms. And if that didn't work, I'd find mescaline, and if methamphetamine was coming out of Mexico, but that we were using the White Crosses back in those days. And, I would always find a way to do more. And the more you do, the more you're going to want, because your body's going to get, used to it, if you will. And if you want to stay high, it's a full-time job for most people who suffer from addiction. And that intervention doesn't help and now you're talking about the crack pipe vending machines next to the Narcan vending machines. And now with the level of purity that's coming through with the stuff that's been, manufactured synthetically, even Narcan's not doing it on the first, spray. You're going to have to hit 2 or 3 of them. And that's part of why I'm involved with, Larry Kenmore and Rotary, trying to figure out how we educate. And I'm encouraged, we're having these interesting conversations about education, prevention, and addiction treatment. And Rotary is a major platform to get that message out internationally. And I know you've spoken to them. So it's interesting as we have these conversations, if we had to find a solution or 2 or 3 based on your, lived experience with this, what would your highest and best recommendations be for individuals, communities, leaders, people in the treatment world, the influencers, and the lawmakers? What do we need to do that we can start implementing?
Well, for me, as a former agent, I look at large holistic strategies, right? I'm looking at the cartels, I'm looking at their capabilities. And when you look at their capabilities, you analyze what they do, you come up with what I call 6 critical capabilities the cartels have to operate. And their most critical capability is their ability to smuggle multi-ton quantities of narcotics from Mexico into the United States using vehicles, rail, and commercial parcel. So if we can't go to Colombia, we can't go to Mexico, we can't go to Bolivia, we can't go to the other drug producing countries and have direct action, we can't disrupt the transportation networks up until the U.S.-Mexican border. That's where we can reach out, and that's where the cartels are vulnerable. But they know that vulnerability is difficult to mitigate because of the number of vehicles coming into the country. My theory, what I would do, I would say if for example, the POE, the point of entry, San Isidro, has 70,000 cars a day. If CBP told me we can search with the right technology, highly trained inspection crews and canines, we can search effectively 20,000 vehicles a day. We can search effectively 10,000 or 1 million parcels a day. Then that's all that comes in the country. we have to go to 100% inspection to mitigate the risk. And we have to start looking at tunnel trafficking, right? A lot of tunnels are being dug. A lot of drugs are being moved through tunnels. Very difficult to stop. But here's the problem. The U.S.-Mexican trade last year was worth $946 billion. So people are going to say, oh, do we want cheap stuff and cheap products, or do we want 100% reduction or 98% reduction in the ability of the cartels to smuggle narcotics into the country? It comes down to those two questions. Do you want your cheap stuff and your cheap products, or do you want to save 100,000 lives? Which do you want? Because we can't do both.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Always hearing it from you, and I think you did a great job explaining, especially the roots and stuff. That's something I was unaware of. My biggest question coming into today with you was the Venezuela stuff. Yeah. And that answered the question of, at least you gave me something to think about, and I think that's what we need to do as humans more, is think about, the bigger picture. You're showing me the big picture, unbiased, non-con, just giving me the information. And I wish the news networks would do that. I wish our government would do that. I wish, all together. But okay, so Scott, this was interesting, but unfortunately I got a hard out and I got to get going. But always interesting talking to you, Michael. I hope you have a good holiday. It's the holiday season, and that's it. What do you got, Scott?
Well, it's always, I'm obviously passionate about this topic, and Michael, I appreciate your sharing with us, because there aren't many people that are talking about it. I think I asked you this the other day. I think you said you testified recently, and in DC, and I said, who else is talking about it? And there aren't many.
Well, no, not DC. I was in Argentina.
Argentina, even more exciting in Argentina. So, and I've been talking about it for a long time, and people don't, hey, can you come talk about it? It's not something that people want to talk about. It's tough because it's going to require some, hard changes, and there's going to, anytime you change that, and we have, we have Tijuana and San Ysidro, they're both here. So the tunnels have been a really big deal for a long time. And there's, and if they blow up one or pour cement in it, there's another one being built. So, and I've always thought of, the cartel as my competition, so to speak. So anyway, great having you here today. Have a great holiday. And people out there, if you have a family member who's suffering, if you want to talk about what we can do to move this forward, or find ways to educate the government, our thought leaders, our responsible parties, because, we're having election again next year, and people are looking for platforms, not usually this one. You have to bring it up to them. And if you need to talk to somebody, you can call me, 619-993-2738, 619-993-2738, or go on to yourcrisiscoach.com and leave me a message, and let's get you on the air here if you want to talk about what's going on in your life, with your family, your community, and maybe some of your life experiences you've had around addiction, substance abuse, or being a family member who has lost a loved one, because there's a lot of them out there. So happy holidays to everybody.
So, Michael, do you have a podcast yourself?
Yeah, actually, I have a podcast called The Opioid Matrix, and we had Larry on not that long ago from the Rotary Club talking about some of the outstanding work he does. But, the Opioid Matrix podcast is a place where we come have those hard conversations like we had today, right? What's really going on? Let me give you the analytical viewpoint, not a pro or con, but just the facts, and you make your own decision.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate you and all the work you've done and continue to do. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah to both of you, and that's it. So this is your Crisis Coach with Scott H. Silverman, myself, Fred Carroll. Our guest today was Michael Brown. And this is where we talk about the hard to talk about. And hopefully we've educated some people out there. So hang out there for a minute. And that's it. We'll see you in the new year.